Right, I would like to talk about Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. So, I read this novel as a part of Maybe Midrash, which is a readathon hosted by Jason over at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, Felicia from the Little Prairie Library, and Steve Donahue. I'll leave links to their announcement videos below if you want more information, but basically, you read one piece of fiction and one piece of nonfiction that deal seriously with religion over the course of the month of May to participate. And this was my fiction book that I picked. So this was published in 1927. I don't think Willa Cather needs too much of an introduction here on BookTube. And this novel is about Father Jean-Marie Latour and Father Joseph Vaillant. Latour is a bishop and Vaillant is his vicar. They are both originally from France, and at the beginning of this novel, they have been working for many years as missionaries in Cincinnati around the middle of the 19th century, and are reassigned at the start of this novel to a diocese in what is now New Mexico, which at the time wasn't a state. And this novel just follows these two men as they see to their affairs as the pastors of this large diocese, of a population, a flock that is Mexican and Pueblo, and that is sort of very spread out. This area of the country is still sparsely populated to this day, but even back then it was even more sparsely populated, and a lot harder to get around because there were no roads, certainly no railroads, and so everywhere was, a couple days mule ride or horse ride apart from one another. And this novel just follows these two men as they go about their affairs, and it's kind of surprising the amount of this novel that's just taken up by these two men sort of wandering from town to town, performing dozens of marriages and baptisms, because so many of these towns are so remote, they don't have priests, and so, when a couple wants to get together, they don't have anyone to marry them, but, they can't always just wait and wait and wait, because the closest town with a person who can marry them is Santa Fe, where the bishop is based, and, they want to get together, so they just basically start living together as married couples and having children who are unbaptized, and just wait and hope that the bishop shows up to perform these rituals. And so that constitutes a lot of what goes on in this book. But there are a lot of sort of misadventures along the way in terms of these men's taking care of their parish. So there's this one sequence where they're traveling between two towns and they need a place to stay for the night because it's getting late, and they come across this really rundown looking house, and they see if there's anyone living there, and there's this really sketchy guy who lives there, and they're like, well, this guy seems sketchy, but we need a place to stay, so let's just stay here. And the man has them sit down in front of his fire, and he's ostensibly getting them food and getting their horses situated in his stable, or their mules situated in his stable, when all of a sudden the man's wife sort of comes to them and warns them that they should probably leave because he'll probably murder them. So they get out of there, and later in the novel, the woman flees to that town that they were headed to, and it's revealed that she had been horribly abused by that man for years and years, and the two pastors help her get out of that situation and get a better life. There's also a whole sequence where this one particular priest in this town tries to break away from the Catholic Church and start his own religion, but then has this sort of deathbed confession and repentance. And so there are misadventures along the way. There's also some scenes about these two men's pasts together. They're both originally from France, Father Vaillant and Father Latour. And we see scenes of them in seminary together, getting trained as priests, and we see a lot of their sort of relationship with one another. They are very good friends, and it was a very moving portrayal of a friendship, I think, between these two men. And we get, sort of various fictionalized accounts of historical figures and sort of monuments. So we get a whole sequence where someone tells the story of how Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City came about, how it was created, this sort of legend around it, and so on and so forth. And we also get to see the Pueblo communities in this area, many of whom have converted to Catholicism, and so are a part of these two men's parishes. So there's a whole scene where they are climbing this this mesa to get to the top where this Pueblo community is, and Father Latour is very struck by just the epicness of this town, or the epicness of the monument, in contrast with the tininess of the town. And one thing that I did find interesting in this book was that portrayal of the relationship between the Mexican community and the Native American community and the white community, because I'm used to portrayals of white Native American relationships at this time in history being quite hostile, for obvious reasons. But it seems like the Pueblo and the Mexicans, at least, live in some form of, some semblance of harmony with one another. And Father Latour and Vaillant do have some degree of respect for Pueblo religion, or at least Pueblo cultural traditions. And the Pueblo do hold on to a lot of their traditions, even though they've converted to Catholicism. And I thought that was pretty interesting, too. But anyway, there are two major religious themes in this novel that I wanted to touch on because I just found them particularly interesting. And the first of those has to do with prayer and this idea of prayer. And it's one of the religious concepts that I have trouble with, at least with the way that it is bandied about. The term is bandied about in at least the United States, because my knee-jerk reaction whenever anyone says that they'll pray for you, or whenever there's a horrible tragedy and someone says our thoughts and prayers are with you, or when the president declared a national day of prayer for the coronavirus or something, my usual reaction is, that's quite literally the least you can do, so congratulations, And I know that that's an oversimplification, and again, I know that idea that prayer is something you do to pat yourself on the back for doing because it supposedly helps other people is a bastardization of what prayer really is. I think prayer, at its best, is kind of more like a form of meditation, almost. It's a bit more for the sake of the person doing the praying than it is for anyone they might pray for or anything they might pray for. And we see a really beautiful demonstration of that in this novel at one point. So on this really cold December evening in Santa Fe, where the bishop is based, this woman shows up at his church. And this woman is named Sada, and she, Bishop Latour knows her. He knows her history. She is basically a slave to this white Protestant family from Georgia, who basically, she's already a slave, but they, in particular, treat her like dirt because she's Catholic. They don't really give her a good place to sleep. They don't give her particularly warm clothes. They won't let her basically have any association with her religion. She hides her rosary beads in her on her waist because she knows that if the family knows she has them, they will take them away, and they don't let her go to mass and all these things. But in the middle of the night, she sort of snuck away from the family she serves, and came to the church, and Father Latour finds her and just prays with her, basically, prays with her to the Virgin Mary, and sort of lets her take communion and such, and she just takes so much comfort from that, even though it's such a small thing that Bishop Latour could do. And Latour has actually tried to intervene to a degree, and some other people in town have tried to intervene for her to a degree, but there's only so much they can do, right? Because Bishop Latour obviously doesn't have any authority over the family or anything like that. But he sees that just doing this for her, just praying with her, gives her a lot of comfort, and perhaps gives her the strength to move forward. And what Father Latour thinks after this is that never, as he afterward told Father Vaillant, had it been permitted to him to behold such deep experience of the holy joy of religion as on that pale December night. So yeah, I thought that was a beautiful scene. That was one of my favorite scenes. And then another idea in this book that I found interesting was this sort of distinction between spiritualism and sensualism. There is this idea in a lot of religions that in order to sort of attain enlightenment or to be righteous, you need to sort of swear off worldly desires, or at least be very, very moderate with worldly desires. And this may come to the distinction between Father Latour's and Father Vaillant's personalities, because they do have very different personalities. Latour is very quiet and introverted and thoughtful and perhaps more bookish, and Vaillant is more outgoing and charismatic and much more, we might say, by the standards of a Catholic priest, a bit maybe of a party animal. I mean, he loves food and drink and dancing and music. But he and Father Latour kind of says that in a lot of other people he would see that as a failing, because he takes so much joy in these very worldly pleasures. But in Father Vaillant, they almost seem to be a part of his religious devotion. So this is what Latour thinks of him. His vicar was one of the most truly spiritual men he had ever known, though he was so passionately attached to many things of this world. Fond as he was of good eating and drinking, he not only rigidly observed all the fasts of the Church, but he never complained about the hardness and scantiness of the fare on his long missionary journeys. Father Joseph's relish for good wine might have been a fault in another man, but always frail in body, he seemed to need some quick physical stimulant to support his sudden flights of purpose and imagination. And yeah, so this sequence kind of reminded me of something I read in The Color Purple by Alice Walker. That's a novel that I read a few years ago, and unfortunately I don't have my copy anymore, and I didn't record that quote that I'm thinking of, and I couldn't find it online. But basically in The Color Purple at one point, two women are walking through a field of flowers, I believe, and one of them says to the other, that she believes that God would never have created the color purple if he hadn't wanted them to revel in it. She seems, at least this is how I interpret it, she seems to see the act of taking pleasure in these worldly things as a form of devotion, because you're taking joy in God's creations in a certain sense. And I feel like the same thing could be said of Father Vaillant in this scene. And yeah, and I like that, because, much as I see why so many religions have said that worldly desires are the cause of so much suffering, and I see how that is, I also feel that, attachment to worldly things, especially to other people, but also to, food and alcohol and books as objects, I suppose, and other things, are in a large degree how we derive a lot of meaning from our lives. And so I've never quite been able to buy into this idea that you need to release yourself from worldly desires in order to be righteous or to be enlightened or something. Yeah, so anyway, those are the two major religious themes that I saw in this book that struck me, at least. There are a lot of others I feel like I could have talked about, but one of the things I am struck by this novel is how short it is, but how much Willa Cather sort of packed into it. But, if you've read this book, give me your thoughts on it. If you have any thoughts on the issues I've raised, then let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you, as always. And anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Bye, guys.